Stop being dramatic. I'm sure you aren't sick, just pretending.
Please help him!
Asthmatic black boy ignored mid-flight, and until sister's call to CO dad grounds all flight proves that sometimes the flight attendants who dismiss dying teenager as just being dramatic are about to discover that ignoring medical emergency for 40 minutes means losing everything, means badge stripped, means criminal charges, means federal prison time. Because what flight attendants Rebecca Martinez and Craig Henderson didn't know when they decided 15-year-old Xavier Bishop was faking. His asthma attack was that their refusal to provide emergency medical assistance would trigger call from his 13-year-old sister Maya to their father, who happened to be CEO of the airline's parent company, would result in emergency diversion that grounded entire flight, would expose pattern of negligence that had been buried for years, would transform routine dismissal of black teenagers suffering into national scandal that ended with prison sentences, and the confidence with which Rebecca rolled her eyes at wheezing boy, the certainty with which Craig characterized gasping child as dramatic, showed how comfortable flight attendants had become denying medical care to passengers they decided weren't worth helping, how normalized it had become to let black children suffer while assuming they were lying. He looks fine to me. You're probably just anxious. Drink some water and you'll be fine. Stop being dramatic, kid. We're not doctors, so just calm down and sit tight. Some people just want attention and we see it all the time. If you don't return to your seat, I'll have you restrained for disruptive behavior. Rebecca Martinez and Craig Henderson said to Maya Bishop, who was begging for help for her brother Xavier at 30,000 feet on Delta Airlines Flight 2847 from Atlanta to Houston, who was 13 years old and watching her 15-year-old brother's lips turn blue, who'd pressed the call button 6 times in 20 minutes, who'd walked to the galley twice pleading for emergency medical assistance, who'd explained repeatedly that Xavier had severe asthma and his inhaler was empty, who'd done everything a terrified child could do to save her brother's life, who'd been dismissed every single time, who'd been threatened with restraints for asking adults to help dying teenager, and their words hit Maya like accusations, hit her with message that her brother's suffering didn't matter, hit her with recognition that these adults had decided Xavier was faking based on nothing except how he looked. The dismissals "you're just anxious" and "stop being dramatic" landed at row 23 on Flight 2847 with weight of every racist assumption about black people exaggerating pain, seeking attention, being untrustworthy about their own bodies, and Xavier, who was slumped against the window struggling to breathe, felt those words as judgment, felt them as denial of his reality, felt them as death sentence because he knew his body, knew what asthma attack felt like, knew he was dying, and Maya watching her. Brother Fade felt terror that was absolute, felt powerlessness that came from being child begging adults who refused to see emergency happening in front of them, felt desperation that grew with each minute that passed, with each shallow breath Xavier managed, with each moment that brought him closer to the point where intervention would be too late, and they were trapped at 30,000 feet with no escape, with no options except to keep begging people who decided they weren't worth saving. This wasn't something their parents had warned might happen in distant past. This wasn't medical discrimination their grandparents had faced during segregation that existed only in history. This was happening right now in 2025 on major commercial airline where emergency medical protocols supposedly existed, where flight attendants were supposedly trained to recognize distress, where children having medical emergencies were supposedly prioritized, but here were Rebecca and Craig dismissing Xavier's asthma attack as anxiety, characterizing his sister's pleas as attention-seeking, threatening 13-year-old with restraints for trying to save her brother's life. And if you think airline discrimination against black passengers is something we solved, if you believe flight attendants no longer profile travelers based on race, if you imagine that having documented medical condition protects you from adults who've decided you're faking, then you need to understand that medical racism didn't disappear with civil rights legislation. It just learned to operate through dismissals of pain and characterizations of dramatic behavior and threats against family members who advocate too loudly. Maybe worse now because it happens while everyone pretends healthcare is colorblind, while people deny that black patients still die from being disbelieved, while flight attendants feel comfortable letting teenagers suffocate because they assume no consequences will come. Xavier and Maya had experienced microaggressions before, had dealt with teachers who seemed surprised by their achievements, store employees who followed them, adults who made assumptions based on their appearance, but having flight attendants dismiss life-threatening medical emergency, having them characterize dying brother as dramatic, having them threaten sister with restraints for begging for help, felt different. Felt like racism that was comfortable causing death. Felt like negligence. That assumed black teenagers' life didn't matter enough to warrant basic medical response, and they'd been shocked when Rebecca first said Xavier looked fine despite his obvious distress, had thought maybe she didn't understand severity, but as minutes passed and his condition worsened and crew continued dismissing them, as his lips turned blue and his breathing became gasps and still no help came, Maya realized with crushing recognition that this wasn't about misunderstanding, this was about Rebecca and Craig looking at black teenagers and deciding their suffering wasn't real, and while shocking it also wasn't entirely surprising because their father had warned them about medical racism, had told them that black patients get dismissed, had prepared them for possibility that their pain wouldn't be believed, but knowing it could happen didn't make experiencing it less terrifying, didn't make watching her brother die less devastating, didn't prepare Maya for the reality of begging for 40 minutes while adults with power to help chose to do nothing. Please, my brother has asthma, his inhaler is empty, he needs medical assistance right now. Do you have emergency medication? Please help him. He can't breathe properly, Maya said with voice that shook with terror, with tone that tried to convey urgency, with words that should have triggered immediate response. My brother is really sick, he can't breathe. Please help us. He's not faking, he could die. His breathing is getting worse. Please just look at him. Please do something, and her pleas were desperate and articulate and heartbreaking. Were sister trying to save brother's life. Were child hoping that surely adults would help once they understood how serious this was. But Rebecca and Craig heard her desperation and characterized it as drama, heard her fear and called it attention-seeking, heard her love for her brother and threatened her with restraints. If you believe children deserve medical care regardless of their skin color, keep watching because what happens when Maya makes one phone call will show you that sometimes justice actually comes, and if you've ever had your pain dismissed by healthcare workers who decided you were exaggerating, drop a comment below and tell us your story, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because you need to see what happens when dismissing black teenagers' medical emergency means ignoring the CEO's son. This story doesn't end the way Rebecca and Craig expect. So hit that like button if you stand against medical racism and subscribe to this channel because we're exposing discrimination that kills. Other passengers in nearby rows watched Xavier's condition deteriorate, watched him slump against window gasping, watched his sister beg for help repeatedly, watched flight attendants dismiss the situation multiple times, and some looked concerned, some whispered to companions, some pulled out phones to record, but not one person challenged the crew's assessment. Not one passenger demanded medical response. Not one adult used their voice to advocate for dying child, and their collective silence gave Rebecca and Craig permission to continue their negligence, gave them confidence that witnesses agreed Xavier was faking, gave them sense that letting him suffer was acceptable, and Maya, looking at all those adults watching without helping, felt abandoned by everyone except her brother who was too busy fighting for breath to comfort her, felt alone in her terror. Felt like she and Xavier existed in bubble of crisis that everyone could see but no one would enter. Xavier's eyes fluttered as Maya held his hand, fluttered with consciousness that was fading, fluttered with recognition that he was dying, and he whispered with voice that was barely audible, "Maya, I'm scared." And those 3 words, hearing her brother admit his fear, hearing him acknowledge what they both knew was happening, broke something in Maya that made her understand she had one option left, one person who would believe her, one adult who would help no matter what, and she reached for her phone with hands that shook, reached for connection to father who'd told them to call if anything went wrong, reached for rescue that she prayed would come in time, but to understand how 15-year-old with documented asthma ended up dying on airplane while flight attendants dismissed his suffering, how 13-year-old sister ended up making phone call that would ground entire flight and destroy multiple careers. How trip to celebrate grandfather's retirement became medical emergency that exposed systemic negligence. We need to go back 8 hours to morning in their Atlanta home where this day started not with crisis but with excitement and sibling bonds and father's careful preparation of children he was trusting with independence. Xavier Marcus Bishop was 15 years old and sophomore at Benjamin Mays High School, was honor student who loved debate team and chemistry, was tall for his age which made adults sometimes forget he was still child, was gentle soul who looked after his younger sister fiercely, who'd had asthma since he was 3 years old, who'd learned to manage his condition carefully, who carried inhaler everywhere, who knew his triggers, who understood his body's warning signs, who'd been taught by his parents exactly what to do during attacks, and he'd been so excited about this trip to Houston, about celebrating his grandfather's retirement, about traveling with just Maya, about proving to their father that they could handle responsibility of flying alone, and he'd packed his bag carefully that morning, had remembered his clothes and his gifts and his phone charger, had checked everything on the list their father had given them. But in his excitement he'd made one critical error, had forgotten to verify his inhaler had doses remaining, had assumed it was full, had put it in his backpack without checking, and that oversight, that single moment of teenage carelessness, would nearly cost him his life. Maya Grace Bishop was 13 years old and 8th grader at same school, was Xavier's little sister and best friend, was girl who'd always relied on her big brother to protect her, who'd never imagined she'd have to be the one saving him, who was smart and assertive but still young enough to believe adults would help when children needed them, who'd been so proud that their father trusted them to travel alone, who'd promised to look after Xavier even though he was older because that's what siblings did for each other. And she carried in her backpack the speech she'd written for their grandfather's ceremony, carried the photo album she'd made of family memories, carried her phone with emergency contacts their father had programmed, carried everything she thought she might need except preparation for watching her brother die while flight attendants refused to help. The siblings had that particular bond of children who'd grown up as each other's primary companions, who'd attended same schools, shared same friends, protected each other from bullies and disappointments, who could communicate with glances, who knew each other's fears and dreams, and Xavier had always been Maya's defender, had always stepped between his smaller sister and anything that might hurt her, had always used his size and his words to shield Maya from cruelty, but their relationship had shifted slightly in past year, had evolved as Maya grew more confident and Xavier learned to let her advocate for herself, and both of them had been looking forward to this trip as opportunity to demonstrate their maturity, to prove they could handle adult responsibilities, to make their father proud by traveling safely and celebrating family milestone. And neither could have imagined that trip would test them in ways that had nothing to do with navigation or time management. That morning they'd woken early with excitement that made sleeping impossible, had packed their carry-on bags with gifts for their grandfather, had helped each other decide what to wear, had taken photos in their living room to document this milestone, and their father Raymond Bishop had driven them to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport himself despite his busy schedule, had spent the drive reviewing emergency procedures, had made sure they had his direct number and understood they should call for any reason, had hugged them both tight at departures saying, "I'm so proud of you both, call me when you board, text me when you land, have amazing time celebrating Grandpa, tell him I wish I could be there but I'll see him next week," and the siblings had walked into terminal feeling grown up and responsible and ready. Check-in had been smooth, TSA security had been routine, and they'd proceeded to their gate with plenty of time, had found seats in waiting area and played games on their phones while waiting, had texted their father updates, had watched other passengers with curiosity, and when boarding was called they'd gathered their bags and joined the line, had shown their boarding passes and walked down the jetway, had found their seats in row 23, economy seats near the back of the plane, and they'd settled in with Xavier taking the window seat and Maya in the middle, and other flight attendants had been pleasant during boarding, had helped them stow their bags, had offered them drinks, had created atmosphere that suggested this would be routine flight, that nothing would go wrong, that their father's trust in their independence was justified. But 30 minutes into flight, when Xavier felt his chest tighten, when he reached for his inhaler and found it empty, when panic flickered in his eyes and he whispered to Maya that he needed help, everything changed, and Rebecca Martinez, who'd seemed professional during boarding, approached their row with annoyed expression, and when Maya explained the situation, when she said her brother had asthma and needed medical assistance, Rebecca's expression shifted from annoyance to something else. Shifted as she looked at Xavier in his hoodie, shifted as she made assessment based on appearance rather than symptoms, and she said, "He looks fine to me," with tone that communicated she'd decided this wasn't real emergency, and that initial dismissal, that first refusal to take them seriously, set pattern that would continue for 40 minutes, would nearly kill Xavier, would expose medical racism that operated through assumptions about who deserved care and who was faking, would reveal how Comfortable flight attendants had become dismissing black passengers' medical emergencies. Rebecca glanced at Xavier, who sat slumped in his window seat with chest heaving, glanced at this tall black teenager wearing gray hoodie, glanced with eyes that showed she was making judgment based on how he looked rather than what symptoms he displayed, and her expression shifted from professional annoyance at being called to something darker, shifted to suspicion that seemed automatic, shifted to assessment that communicated she'd decided before hearing full explanation that this wasn't legitimate medical situation, and she said he looks fine to me with voice that was dismissive, with tone that suggested Maya was overreacting, with certainty that came from having already decided this teenager in hoodie couldn't possibly be having real emergency, and her words, her immediate dismissal without examination, without questions about medical history, without basic assessment of his condition, showed how racial profiling operated in medical contexts, how assumptions about who was trustworthy shaped who received care. Xavier's breathing was growing more labored now, was becoming obviously distressed even to casual observer, was deteriorating in ways that should have alarmed any trained flight attendant, and he managed to gasp out, "Please, I can't breathe properly," managed to communicate his distress despite struggling for air, managed to ask for help with voice that wheezed, with words that came between desperate inhales, with plea that should have triggered immediate response. But Rebecca looked at him, wheezing and sweating and struggling, looked at clear signs of respiratory distress, looked at teenager who was obviously in crisis, and she rolled her eyes, actually made gesture of contempt and disbelief, actually communicated through body language that she thought he was performing, and she said, "You're probably just anxious, drink some water, you'll be fine," and then she walked away from dying child, walked away with confidence that her assessment was correct, walked away, leaving Maya staring after her in disbelief. Maya's heart was pounding now, was racing with fear that was building, was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she looked at her brother whose breathing was getting worse, whose face was showing strain, whose body was fighting for oxygen, and she pressed the call button again, pressed it with desperate hope that maybe different flight attendant would help, pressed it while Xavier wheezed beside her, pressed it while other passengers started noticing something was wrong, pressed it because she didn't know what else to do, and another flight attendant appeared, this one male, this one named Craig Henderson, who was 45 and had worked for airline for 12 years, and Maya said with voice that shook, "My brother is having an asthma attack. He needs help now, please," and her plea was urgent, was clear, was specific about the medical condition and the need for immediate assistance. Craig looked at Xavier, who was now wheezing audibly enough that passengers in nearby rows could hear, who had sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool cabin temperature, who was displaying obvious signs of respiratory distress that should have been unmistakable, and Craig's face showed he was processing what he saw, was making assessment, was deciding how to respond, and his decision, his choice in that moment, revealed same racial bias that Rebecca had shown, revealed same comfort with dismissing black teenagers' suffering, revealed same assumption that this wasn't real emergency, and he said, "Kids, stop being dramatic, we're not doctors, just calm down and sit tight," and his characterization of Xavier's struggle to breathe as drama, his refusal to provide any assistance, his dismissal of legitimate medical emergency as attention-seeking behavior, showed how deeply medical racism was embedded, how automatically it operated, how comfortable these adults were letting black child suffer. Craig left without offering any help, left without checking Xavier's vital signs, left without asking about medical history, left without consulting with captain about medical emergency, left without doing single thing that airline protocols required when passenger reported respiratory distress, and he walked away casually like this was routine nuisance rather than life-threatening situation. Walked away while Xavier's breathing grew more labored, walked away while Maya watched in horror. Walked away while other passengers pretended not to notice, and his negligence, his complete failure to respond appropriately to medical emergency, represented violation of duty that would eventually result in criminal charges. But in that moment it just meant Xavier continued suffering without help, continued fighting for breath without intervention, continued declining toward crisis point while crew did nothing. 10 minutes passed after Craig's dismissal, 10 minutes where Xavier's condition visibly worsened, 10 minutes where his lips began turning slightly blue from oxygen deprivation, 10 minutes where his chest heaved with every breath in a way that looked painful, 10 minutes where sweat soaked through his shirt, 10 minutes where he slumped further against the window, 10 minutes where Maya watched her brother fade, 10 minutes where help didn't come despite obvious medical emergency, 10 minutes. That brought Xavier closer to point where intervention would be too late, and during those 10 minutes passengers in nearby rows noticed the wheezing that was getting louder, noticed the teenager who was clearly in distress, noticed the young girl sitting beside him with terror visible on her face, noticed but did nothing, said nothing, helped in no way. A white woman sitting across the aisle in row 23 looked concerned as she watched Xavier struggle, looked with expression that showed she recognized something was wrong, looked with face that communicated discomfort at what she was witnessing, but she said nothing, didn't call for flight attendant, didn't offer to help, didn't use her voice to advocate for dying child, and her concerned look without action represented moral failure, represented choice to witness rather than intervene, represented decision that her comfort mattered more than Xavier's life, and watching her look concerned but stay silent made Maya feel abandoned, made her understand that even people who recognized the emergency wouldn't help them, made her realize they were truly alone. A man sitting in row 24 behind them had clear view of Xavier's distress, had been close enough to hear Maya's initial pleas to Rebecca and Craig, had witnessed both flight attendants dismiss the situation, had seen Xavier's condition deteriorate over 10 minutes, and his response to watching teenagers struggle to breathe was to put on headphones, was to deliberately tune out the crisis happening in front of him, was to choose music over moral responsibility, and his action of blocking out Xavier's suffering, his choice to pretend he wasn't seeing medical emergency, his decision that ignoring dying child was acceptable, showed how bystander apathy worked, showed how people rationalized inaction, showed how easily witnesses became complicit through silence, and Maya watching him put on those headphones, watching him deliberately choose not to see or hear, felt betrayal that added to her terror, felt abandoned by adults who should have helped, felt isolated in ways that made the confined aircraft cabin feel like prison where she and Xavier existed alone with his dying. Maya couldn't sit still anymore watching Xavier fade, couldn't stay in her seat while her brother suffocated, couldn't accept that no help was coming unless she made it impossible to ignore, and she stood up with legs that shook, stood up with determination born from desperation, stood up and walked down the aisle toward the galley where she'd seen Rebecca and Craig disappear, walked past passengers who looked away, walked past witnesses who pretended not to see, walked toward flight attendants who'd already dismissed them twice, walked because doing nothing meant watching Xavier die, and she found Rebecca and Craig in the galley chatting casually, found them laughing about something, found them completely unconcerned about medical emergency they'd been told about, found them comfortable enough in their dismissal to continue their conversation while teenagers struggled for breath 30 feet away. "Please," Maya said with voice that cracked from crying she'd been holding back, with tone that carried every ounce of fear she felt, with desperation that should have moved anyone with basic humanity. "My brother is really sick, he can't breathe, please help us, his lips are turning blue, he's getting worse, please you have to do something," and her plea was specific, was detailed, was urgent, was everything that should have triggered emergency response, was child begging adults to save her brother's life, was sister watching sibling die asking for help one more time, and Rebecca and Craig looked at her like she was inconvenience rather than child reporting medical emergency, looked at her with expressions that showed annoyance rather than concern, looked at her like her brother's suffering was burden they didn't want to carry. Rebecca sighed heavily hearing Maya's plea, sighed like she was dealing with difficult passenger rather than dying child, sighed with sound that communicated she found this situation tiresome, and she said, "Little girl, we already told you, he's fine. Go sit down before you cause a scene," and her characterization of Maya as little girl rather than by name, her repetition that Xavier was fine despite all evidence to contrary, her threat that Maya was causing scene by asking for medical help, showed contempt that went beyond negligence into cruelty, showed she decided these black children weren't worth her time or effort, showed she valued maintaining her convenience over saving life. And Craig added to Rebecca's dismissal saying some people just want attention, we see it all the time, and his suggestion that Xavier's medical emergency was attention-seeking, his characterization of legitimate asthma attack as performance, his claim that seeing it all the time made him expert who could dismiss without examination, revealed pattern of bias, revealed he'd probably dismissed other black passengers before, revealed comfort with letting people suffer based on assumptions about who deserved belief. Maya's eyes filled with tears hearing their dismissals, filled with grief and terror and rage, filled with recognition that these adults wouldn't help no matter what she said, filled with understanding that they'd decided her brother's life didn't matter, and she said with voice that broke, "He's not faking, he could die. Please, I'm begging you." And her words were stripped of dignity, were pure desperate plea. Were sister willing to humiliate herself if it meant saving Xavier? Were child reduced to begging adults who should have helped automatically? Were last attempt to reach whatever humanity existed in these flight attendants? But Rebecca's response showed there was no humanity to reach, showed she'd committed fully to her racist assessment, showed she viewed Maya's tears as manipulation rather than genuine fear. "If you don't return to your seat," Rebecca said with voice that turned cold, with tone that carried threat, with authority that was weaponized against child, "I'll have you restrained for disruptive behavior. Is that what you want? Do you want to be handcuffed to your seat for the rest of this flight? Because I can make that happen." And her threat to restrain 13-year-old for trying to save her brother's life. Her characterization of reporting medical emergency as disruptive behavior, her willingness to use force against child who was begging for help, represented abuse of power so severe it would eventually result in criminal charges. But in that moment, it just meant Maya had to choose between continuing to advocate and being physically restrained, had to weigh whether fighting would make things worse, had to calculate whether adults who'd already shown this much cruelty might actually hurt her if she didn't comply. Maya stumbled back to her seat sobbing, stumbled with vision blurred by tears, stumbled past passengers who'd heard Rebecca threaten her, stumbled past witnesses who stayed silent, stumbled back to Xavier who was slumped against the window barely conscious now, who'd heard enough of the confrontation to understand no help was coming, who was too weak to comfort his sister, who was using all his remaining energy just to breathe. And Maya collapsed into her seat beside him, feeling defeat that was crushing, feeling powerlessness that was absolute, feeling terror that her brother was dying and she tried everything and failed, and she looked at Xavier and saw his breathing was shallow now, was ragged in a way that sounded like death, was barely sufficient to keep him alive. "Xavier, stay with me," Maya pleaded with voice that was desperate, with tone that tried to will him to keep fighting. "Please stay with me, don't close your eyes. Keep breathing, help is coming, someone will help us." And her words were lies because she didn't believe help was coming anymore, because she'd been dismissed 3 times, because Rebecca had threatened to restrain her, because every adult on this plane had shown they wouldn't intervene. But she said the words anyway because she needed Xavier to hear them, needed him to keep fighting, needed him to believe rescue was possible even though she'd lost that belief herself. And Xavier's eyes fluttered hearing her voice, fluttered with effort to respond, fluttered with consciousness that was fading. "Maya, I'm scared," Xavier whispered with voice that was barely audible, with words that came between gasps, with admission that broke Maya's heart completely because Xavier was her big brother, was supposed to be the strong one, was person who protected her, and hearing him admit fear, hearing him acknowledge what they both knew was happening, hearing him sound so young and vulnerable, made Maya understand with devastating clarity that she was watching her brother die, that these were possibly his last words, that she might lose him here on this plane while flight attendants chatted in the galley and passengers looked away. If you're watching this and you've ever chosen your comfort over someone else's crisis, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being the person who speaks up, because what happens during the next 27 minutes while Xavier fights for his life will show you what silence costs. Will show you that witnessing isn't helping, so hit that subscribe button if you believe children deserve adults who intervene, not just observe. She grabbed Xavier's hand and it was cold, was clammy in a way that terrified her, was temperature that didn't feel alive, was wrong in every way, and she held it tighter trying to warm it, trying to communicate through touch that she was there, trying to anchor him to consciousness, and time started moving in strange way, started feeling both impossibly slow and terrifyingly fast. Slow because every second of watching Xavier suffer felt eternal, fast because she could feel him slipping away, could sense his life force diminishing, could recognize that minutes were all that remained between her brother living and dying, and Maya sat there holding his cold hand while tears streamed down her face, while her chest felt like it was being crushed, while she tried to figure out what else she could possibly do. What option remained when flight attendants refused to help and passengers refused to intervene and her brother was dying and she was 13 years old and powerless? For 27 more minutes after Rebecca threatened to restrain her, for 27 agonizing minutes that felt like hours, for 27 minutes that represented longest period of Maya's life, she watched her brother fade, watched him slip further from consciousness, watched his breathing become more shallow and irregular, watched his lips go from slightly blue to deeply blue, watched his skin take on grayish tinge, watched signs of oxygen deprivation multiply, watched her big brother, who'd always protected her, become smaller and more vulnerable and closer to death with every passing minute. And during those 27 minutes she begged, she cried, she prayed, she pressed the call button again and again, hoping someone different would respond, hoping someone with compassion would appear, hoping that surely someone on this aircraft cared whether teenager lived or died. Every call button press was ignored during those 27 minutes. Every press of that little white button that should have summoned help resulted in nothing. No flight attendant appeared, no response came, the button that was supposed to connect passengers to assistance became meaningless, became symbol of abandonment, became reminder that she and Xavier were alone in this crisis, and Maya pressed it anyway. Pressed it with desperation that grew, pressed it knowing it wouldn't work, but unable to accept that no help would come, pressed it because pressing it felt like doing something even though it accomplished nothing, and watching that button fail to bring rescue over and over broke something in her, taught her that systems designed to help didn't always work, that calling for assistance didn't guarantee response, that sometimes people just let you die. Every plea Maya made during those 27 minutes was dismissed. Every time she stood up to try getting flight attendants' attention, she was waved away. Every attempt to advocate for her brother was treated as nuisance, and other passengers watched this happen, watched 13-year-old girl desperately trying to save her brother, watched flight attendants ignore medical emergency, watched teenagers' condition deteriorate visibly, and their continued silence, their sustained refusal to intervene, their collective decision that this wasn't their problem, showed moral bankruptcy that extended beyond Rebecca and Craig to include every adult on that plane who had voice and chose not to use it, who had power to demand medical response and chose to stay quiet, who witnessed injustice and prioritized their own comfort over child's life. Xavier's condition during those 27 minutes moved from serious to critical to nearly fatal, moved through stages of oxygen deprivation that caused progressively worse damage, moved toward point where even immediate intervention might not save him, and Maya, watching this progression, felt helpless in ways that traumatized her permanently, felt powerless in ways that would require years of therapy to process, felt terror that was pure and absolute, felt like she was being forced to watch her brother die in slow motion while unable to stop it, while surrounded by people who could help but wouldn't, while crew members who were supposed to provide medical assistance actively refused, and the cruelty of it, the unnecessary nature of his suffering, the preventable tragedy unfolding because adults had decided black teenager wasn't worth saving, made her feel rage underneath the fear, made her angry in ways 13-year-olds shouldn't have to be angry. Xavier barely moved during those 27 minutes, barely responded when Maya talked to him, barely seemed aware of his surroundings, and his stillness terrified her more than his earlier struggling had, because struggling meant he was fighting, meant he was conscious enough to try, but this stillness suggested he was giving up, suggested his body was shutting down, suggested he was losing battle for life, and Maya squeezed his hand harder, trying to communicate that he needed to keep fighting, trying to will her strength into him, trying to somehow transfer her oxygen to his lungs through desperate hope, and she whispered to him constantly during those 27 minutes, whispered stay with me, whispered I love you, whispered help is coming even though she no longer believed it, whispered anything she could think of to keep him anchored to consciousness. Other passengers' reactions during those 27 minutes varied but all resulted in same inaction. Some looked concerned and did nothing, some deliberately looked away. Some put on headphones or opened magazines to avoid witnessing, some pulled out phones to record but not to call for help, and their different methods of witnessing without helping all contributed to same outcome, which was Xavier continuing to die without intervention, and Maya seeing them record on phones felt particularly cruel, felt like they were documenting her brother's death for entertainment, felt like they valued having viral content more than they valued Xavier's life, felt like final proof that adults on this plane had abandoned basic humanity, and she wanted to scream at them, wanted to demand they help instead of film, wanted to shake them until they understood this was her brother dying, not content for social media. Maya's faith in adults shattered completely during those 27 minutes. Shattered as she learned that authority figures couldn't be trusted. Shattered as she discovered that calling for help didn't guarantee response. Shattered as she understood that her brother's life mattered less to these people than their convenience. And that shattering, that loss of innocence, that education in how cruel world could be, happened while she was 13 years old sitting on airplane watching her brother suffocate, happened in way that would mark her permanently, happened because Rebecca and Craig had looked at black teenagers and decided they weren't worth the effort of providing emergency medical care, and the psychological damage being done to Maya during those 27 minutes would require therapy, would shape her relationship with authority for rest of her life, would teach her that she couldn't rely on systems or adults or protocols, would force her to learn earlier than any child should that sometimes you're truly alone. Xavier's breathing during those 27 minutes became more labored and then paradoxically quieter, became whistle-thin sound that suggested his airways were nearly closed, became rhythm that was irregular and failing, became sound that Maya recognized from somewhere in her memory as what dying sounded like, and hearing that sound coming from her brother, recognizing death approaching, understanding that minutes not hours remained, made panic rise in Maya's throat, made her feel like she couldn't breathe either, made her desperate in ways that exceeded everything she'd felt before, and she looked around the cabin wildly searching for anyone who would help, searching for adult with compassion, searching for passenger with courage, searching for flight attendant with basic decency, and she found none of those things, found only people who'd decided her brother's life wasn't their responsibility, found only witnesses who'd chosen silence, found only adults who'd failed them completely, and the isolation of that moment, the recognition that they were truly alone, the understanding that Xavier might actually die here while surrounded by people, felt like nightmares she couldn't wake from. Maya tried everything she could think of during the final minutes of that 27-minute period, tried positioning Xavier more upright hoping gravity would help, tried talking to him constantly to keep him conscious, tried rubbing his hands to improve circulation, tried remembering anything her parents had ever said about asthma attacks, tried implementing every scrap of knowledge she possessed, tried using 13-year-old's limited understanding of medical care to somehow keep her brother alive, and nothing worked, nothing improved his condition, nothing stopped his decline, nothing changed the fundamental reality that he was suffocating and needed medical intervention she couldn't provide, and watching her efforts fail, watching Xavier continue deteriorating despite everything she tried, made her feel useless, made her hate her own powerlessness, made her rage at being child in situation that required adult knowledge and authority. Xavier's eyes during those final minutes stayed closed more than open, stayed shut in way that suggested consciousness was slipping, stayed dark while Maya begged him to look at her, and the few times his eyelids fluttered open his gaze was unfocused, was distant in way that terrified her, was looking at something she couldn't see, and Maya wondered with horror if he was already halfway gone. If he was seeing whatever existed beyond life, if she was losing him not just physically but spiritually, and that thought, that image of Xavier drifting away from her into death while she sat helpless beside him, while flight attendants chatted and passengers ignored them, made her sob harder, made tears fall so fast she couldn't see, made grief overwhelm her so completely she could barely function. Other passengers' continued silence during these final minutes represented collective moral failure so profound it would haunt some of them forever, represented choice that couldn't be undone, represented moment when they decided convenience mattered more than life, and years later some of them would remember the black teenager dying in row 23, would remember his sister crying and begging, would remember their own silence, would remember that they'd had power to demand medical response and chose not to use it, would remember that their inaction contributed to near death of child, and that memory would follow them, would surface at unexpected moments, would remind them of who they'd been in crisis, would force them to confront their own cowardice. But in this moment their silence just meant Xavier continued dying, just meant Maya continued suffering alone, just meant racism operated without challenge or consequence. The white woman across the aisle who'd looked concerned 40 minutes ago looked even more concerned now as Xavier's condition became obviously critical, looked with face that showed she recognized he was dying, looked with expression that communicated she knew this was emergency, but she still said nothing, still didn't call for flight attendant, still didn't use her voice, still chose her own comfort over Xavier's life. And her continued silence despite obvious crisis, her sustained inaction. Despite clear danger, her choice to witness death without intervening showed how deeply ingrained the habit of non-involvement was, showed how easily people rationalized letting others suffer, showed how bystander effect worked to prevent intervention even when intervention was desperately needed, and Maya catching her eye at one point, making direct eye contact with this woman who was watching her brother die. Felt something break when the woman looked away, felt betrayal that was profound, felt abandoned by every adult on this aircraft. The man behind them who'd put on headphones earlier still wore them, still had music playing, still had chosen to block out the sounds of Xavier struggling to breathe, still had decided that his entertainment mattered more than teenager's life, and his sustained avoidance during these critical minutes, his deliberate choice to remain oblivious, his commitment to not getting involved, represented apathy so complete it bordered on cruelty, represented choice to value his own peace over child's. Survival represented decision that would make him complicit in whatever happened, and Maya wanting to rip those headphones off his head, wanting to force him to hear Xavier dying, wanting to make him confront what his silence was enabling, felt rage that mixed with her grief, felt fury that these adults were letting this happen. Maya's mind during these minutes was racing through possibilities, racing through options that mostly didn't exist, racing through desperate calculations about what she could do, and she kept coming back to one memory, kept remembering her father Raymond at the airport that morning saying if you're ever in real trouble, call me, no matter what, kept hearing his voice promising to help if they needed him, kept thinking about the phone in her pocket, kept weighing whether calling their father counted as real trouble or whether it meant admitting failure, and the internal debate about whether to call, about whether this situation warranted bothering their father, about whether she should handle this herself, showed how thoroughly she'd internalized the lesson that asking for help was weakness, showed how much she wanted to prove she was mature enough for this trip, showed how even in crisis children worry about disappointing parents. But watching Xavier's chest barely moving, watching his lips that were now deeply blue, watching his body that seemed more corpse than living person, watching her brother who she loved more than anything slip away while she sat powerless, made Maya understand that pride didn't matter, that proving maturity didn't matter, that nothing mattered except keeping Xavier alive, and she made choice that would save his life, made determination that she wouldn't let him die without trying. Everything, and she reached into her pocket with shaking hand, reached for phone that represented last hope, reached for connection to father who'd promised to help, reached for rescue that she prayed would come in time even though she didn't know how he could possibly reach them at 30,000 feet, and with fingers that trembled so badly she could barely operate the touchscreen, with vision blurred by tears, with desperation that made her movements frantic, she pulled out her phone and connected to the plane's Wi-Fi, connected with hope that felt like drowning person reaching for life preserver, connected because this was final option, because every other avenue had failed, because Xavier was dying and their father had said to call if anything went wrong. Maya pulled up her father's contact with hands that shook violently, pulled up Raymond Bishop's number that was programmed as favorites, pulled up connection to parent who'd raised them to be independent but who'd promised unconditional support, and she pressed call with thumb that left moisture from her tears on the screen, pressed call while her heart pounded so hard it hurt, pressed call while Xavier made whistling sound that suggested each breath might be his last, pressed call while 40 minutes of trauma crashed over her, pressed call while silently begging please answer, please hear me, please help us, and the phone rang once in her ear, rang with sound that seemed impossibly loud, rang while she held breath waiting, and then her father's voice came through clear and strong and familiar, came with greeting that was casual because he didn't yet know that his children were in crisis, came with tone that expected routine check-in, and he said Maya, everything okay, and those 3 words, hearing her father's voice, hearing adult who would believe her and help her and save Xavier, made Maya's composure that she'd been barely maintaining shatter completely. She could barely speak through her sobs, could barely form words through crying that came from 40 minutes of terror, could barely articulate through grief and fear and desperation, and what came out was broken and gasping and desperate, was Daddy Xavier can't breathe, his inhaler is empty, the flight attendants won't help, they keep ignoring us, they said he's faking, they threatened to restrain me, Daddy he's turning blue, his lips are blue. He's barely conscious, I think he's dying, Daddy. I think my brother is dying and nobody will help us, and saying those words out loud, admitting to her father that Xavier was dying, acknowledging that she tried everything and failed, confessing that she needed rescue, made her cry harder, made her sob so hard she could barely breathe herself, made her feel like she was breaking apart. But she forced the words out anyway because Xavier needed her to communicate the emergency, needed her to make their father understand the severity, needed her to be clear despite her terror. Silence followed Maya's explanation, silence that lasted 2 seconds but felt like eternity, silence where she couldn't hear her father breathing, couldn't hear any response, couldn't know if he understood, and during that silence Maya's mind raced through terrible possibilities, wondered if the call had dropped, wondered if he hadn't heard, wondered if even her father couldn't help, but then his voice came back and it was different, was transformed from casual greeting into something else. Entirely, into tone that carried steel underneath, into voice that communicated absolute authority, into sound that made Maya understand that help was coming, that rescue was mobilizing, that her father had heard and believed and was already moving to save Xavier, and Raymond said with control that was terrifying in its calmness, with words that were precisely delivered, with tone that made her understand he was already taking action. Maya listened carefully. Stay with your brother, keep him upright, keep talking to him. I'm handling this right now. Do you understand me? Yes, Daddy, Maya managed to say through her tears, managed to acknowledge his instructions, managed to communicate that she heard him, and Raymond said I love you both, help is coming right now, I promise you help is coming, and then the call ended with click that left Maya holding phone to her ear, ended with silence that felt different from earlier silence, ended with knowledge that something had shifted, that forces had been set in motion, that their father who they'd called as last resort was doing something, and Maya didn't know what he could possibly do from wherever he was, didn't understand how he could help when they were trapped on airplane, didn't know that her father Raymond Bishop wasn't just man who worked high up in airline industry as she'd been told, didn't know he was CEO of the airline's parent company, didn't know he controlled every flight and every route and every employee, didn't know that what she'd just done was connect dying son to father with power to ground entire aircraft, to mobilize emergency response, to destroy careers of everyone who'd failed his children. What Maya didn't know but was about to discover was that her father Raymond Bishop owned this airline, owned every plane in the fleet, owned every asset and every route, owned the company that employed Rebecca and Craig, owned the infrastructure that kept flights operating, and he just heard his 15-year-old son was dying while his staff refused to provide medical care. Had just heard his 13-year-old daughter begging for help that wasn't coming, had just learned that his children, who he trusted with independence, were being failed by system he controlled, and that knowledge, that recognition that his son was suffocating while employees ignored medical emergency, that understanding that Maya had been threatened with restraints for trying to save her brother, transformed Raymond from father into force of nature, transformed his grief and rage into action that would be swift and absolute and devastating to everyone who'd failed his children. Raymond made one phone call after Maya hung up, made one call that would change everything, made one call that demonstrated power he possessed, and he dialed the airline's chief operating officer with hands that were steady despite fury that made his vision narrow, dialed with focus that came from years of executive decision-making, dialed with certainty about what needed to happen. And when the CEO answered, Raymond's voice was calm but carried weight that made grown man on other end of line immediately understand this was crisis, and Raymond said with words that were precisely articulated, with tone that communicated this was not negotiable, with authority that came from owning everything, Flight 2847 to Houston, my children are on board, my son is having severe asthma attack, your crew has been ignoring them for nearly 40 minutes. I want that plane grounded at nearest airport immediately. I want medical personnel waiting on tarmac. I want every crew member's name on my desk. Within the hour, and his instructions were clear, were specific, were delivered with expectation of immediate compliance. The COO stammered hearing this, stammered with recognition of who was calling, stammered understanding that CO's children were in crisis, stammered knowing that failure to act would mean his own termination, and he said, "Sir, grounding flight midair requires," attempting to explain procedures, attempting to communicate complexity, attempting to suggest this would be difficult. But Raymond cut him off with voice that got quieter but more dangerous, with tone that made clear he had zero patience. for obstacles, and he said I don't care what it requires, ground it now, or you're fired before this call ends. Do you understand me? This is my son dying while your employees do nothing. Ground that plane immediately. And the COO, hearing that ultimatum, hearing threat that was absolute, hearing CO willing to fire him in real time, said yes sir, immediately sir, I'll handle it right now. And he hung up to mobilize emergency diversion procedures, to contact air traffic control, to order captain, to make unscheduled landing, to deploy resources that would save Xavier's life, to set in motion chain of events that would expose Rebecca and Craig's negligence. Within 4 minutes of Raymond's call, within 4 minutes that represented fastest emergency response in airlines history, within 4 minutes that showed what happened when CO demanded action, the pilot of Flight 2847 received urgent directive from headquarters, received message marked highest priority, received communication that made clear this was not suggestion but order. And Captain David Morrison, who'd been flying routine path toward Houston, suddenly had message on his screen saying, divert immediately to nearest suitable airport, medical emergency on board, CO's son critical condition, authorize all necessary measures, and reading those words, understanding that company owner's child was dying on his aircraft, understanding that his crew had apparently failed to escalate medical emergency, made Captain Morrison's face go pale, made his hands tighten on controls, made him understand his career might be ending depending on what had happened in his cabin. The intercom crackled as Captain Morrison picked up handset, crackled with sound that made passengers throughout cabin look up, crackled with tone that suggested something unusual was happening, and his voice came through speakers saying, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are making emergency diversion due to medical situation on board. We will be landing at Memphis International Airport in approximately 12 minutes. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants prepare cabin for immediate landing, and his announcement sent ripple through aircraft, made passengers murmur with concern, made people look around trying to identify the medical emergency, made business travelers check watches annoyed at delay, made Rebecca and Craig exchange confused looks because they'd reported no medical emergency, because they dismissed Xavier's asthma attack as drama, because they had no idea that their negligence had been reported to CO himself. Passengers throughout cabin reacted to Captain's announcement with mixture of concern and irritation, reacted with questions about what medical situation warranted emergency landing, reacted with complaints about missed connections, reacted with curiosity about who was sick, and some looked toward row 23 where they'd seen teenagers struggling, where they'd witnessed sister begging for help, where they'd watched crisis unfold for 40 minutes, and recognition dawned on some faces, recognition. That maybe this was serious, that maybe the girl hadn't been overreacting, that maybe they should have helped. But their late recognition, their dawning understanding after diversion was already ordered, their belated concern after child had nearly died, showed how easily people dismissed crises until authority validated them, showed how bystander silence persisted until external force intervened. Maya felt plane begin descending, felt aircraft changing altitude, felt mechanical response to her father's intervention, and she whispered to Xavier with voice that mixed hope and residual terror, with tone that tried to reach him wherever his consciousness had gone, help is coming, daddy's coming, the plane is landing, just hold on, please hold on just a little longer, and she squeezed his hand that was still cold, squeezed with desperation that hadn't diminished, squeezed trying to keep him tethered to life through physical contact, and Xavier's eyes remained mostly closed, remained showing only whites when they fluttered open, remained unfocused and distant, and his breathing remained that terrible whistle that suggested his airways were nearly closed, but he was still breathing, was still alive, was still fighting even though he'd been fighting alone for 40 minutes, and Maya watching him cling to life felt pride mixed with her fear, felt love that was overwhelming, felt determination that he would survive this because help was finally coming. Rebecca and Craig standing in galley heard Captain's announcement with confusion that was visible, heard about medical emergency they hadn't reported, heard about diversion they hadn't requested, and they looked at each other with expressions showing they were trying to understand what was happening, trying to figure out who was sick, trying to remember if they'd missed something, and somewhere in their racist minds they began to wonder if maybe that black teenager had actually been having real medical emergency, if maybe they'd made mistake by dismissing him, if maybe this diversion was related to the boy they'd called dramatic, But even considering this possibility, they didn't feel alarm or guilt, didn't immediately rush to row 23 to check on Xavier, didn't recognize yet that their careers were ending, that their negligence was being exposed. That CEO whose son they'd let suffer was already mobilizing their termination. The plane descended rapidly over next 12 minutes, descended toward Memphis where paramedics were already mobilizing, descended while Xavier clung to consciousness by thread, descended while Maya held her brother's hand and whispered encouragement, descended while Rebecca and Craig remained oblivious to consequences approaching, descended while other passengers processed that medical emergency they'd witnessed and ignored was serious enough to divert entire flight, descended while Captain Morrison prepared for landing that would save child's life and end multiple careers, descended through clouds toward airport where Raymond Bishop was already coordinating response, where ambulances waited, where his children would finally receive care that should have been provided 40 minutes earlier. Xavier's eyes were barely open during descent, were showing only slivers of white, were unfocused and rolled back, were sign that consciousness was nearly gone, and Maya watching those eyes, seeing how little of her brother remained aware, seeing how close death had come, felt terror spike again despite knowing help was coming, felt fear that maybe help would arrive too late, felt desperate need to keep Xavier conscious until paramedics reached him, and she talked to him constantly during descent, talked about their grandfather's retirement party, talked about family waiting for them, talked about their father who was coming, talked about anything she could think of to keep him anchored, and she didn't know if he heard her, didn't know if her words reached him, didn't know if he was still there enough to understand, but she talked anyway because silence felt like giving up. The moment plane touched down at Memphis International Airport, moment wheels hit tarmac with slight bounce, moment aircraft began rapid deceleration, Maya felt something release in her chest, felt first hint of hope that Xavier might actually survive, felt recognition that they'd reached ground where help existed, where paramedics waited, where her brother could receive care he desperately needed, and the plane taxied toward gate faster than normal, taxied with urgency that communicated emergency, taxied toward rescue that was 43 minutes overdue, and before aircraft had fully stopped the doors were flying open, were being opened by ground crew who'd been briefed, were revealing paramedics who rushed in with equipment and oxygen and stretcher, who'd been told CEO's son was dying, who understood this was crisis requiring immediate response, who moved through cabin with practiced efficiency, who reached row 23 within seconds, who brought hope that Maya had nearly lost. Severe asthma attack, one paramedic announced while assessing Xavier, while checking his vitals with practiced hands, while seeing blue lips and shallow breathing and signs of prolonged oxygen deprivation, hypoxia setting in, blood oxygen critically low. We need to move now, we need oxygen immediately, and he fitted mask over Xavier's face while his partner prepared stretcher, while third paramedic started while emergency medical care that should have been provided 40 minutes earlier finally arrived, and Maya watching professionals work, watching them treat her brother's condition as emergency it had always been, watching them take his suffering seriously, felt validation that mixed with her relief, felt recognition that she'd been right to be terrified, felt confirmation that Rebecca and Craig's dismissals had been negligent rather than reasonable, and that validation, that professional acknowledgement that Xavier had been dying, mattered to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Xavier was lifted onto stretcher with care that contrasted sharply with how Rebecca and Craig had treated him, was moved with gentleness that recognized his vulnerability, was handled by people who saw dying child rather than dramatic teenager, and oxygen mask over his face was already making difference, was already bringing color back to his lips, was already making his breathing less labored, was already saving his life in ways that were visible, and paramedics carried him off plane with Maya. Following clutching her brother's backpack, following with tears streaming down her face, following with relief and residual terror mixing, following while other passengers watched with expressions that showed various combinations of guilt and concern and belated recognition of severity, and as Maya passed Rebecca and Craig standing in galley she said nothing, made no eye contact, gave no acknowledgement, because she didn't have to, because what was coming for them was bigger than anything she standing at the gate surrounded by airline officials and security personnel, standing with posture that communicated authority and fury, standing with face that showed he was barely containing rage, was Raymond Bishop, was CEO of airline's parent company, was father who just heard his son nearly died while staff did nothing, and he saw Xavier being loaded into ambulance with oxygen mask on his face, saw his 15-year-old son being rushed to hospital, saw evidence that his children had been failed catastrophically, and his jaw tightened seeing that stretcher, his hands clenched seeing paramedics working urgently, his eyes went cold seeing what negligence had done to his child, and then he saw Maya, saw his 13-year-old daughter walking off plane with face that showed trauma, with body language that communicated she'd been through something terrible, with tears that wouldn't stop falling, and seeing his daughter like that, seeing what 43 minutes of watching her brother die had done to her, made something break in Raymond that would never fully heal. Raymond walked directly onto jetway, walked past officials trying to brief him, walked with single-minded focus on his daughter, and he kneeled when he reached her, kneeled so he was at her eye level, kneeled with expensive suit on dirty jetway floor because nothing mattered except reaching Maya, and he held her tight, pulled her into embrace that tried to contain all the fear she'd experienced, tried to communicate that she was safe now, tried to promise that he would handle everything, and Maya collapsed into her father's arms with sobs that came from depths of trauma, with crying that was release of 43 minutes of terror, with shaking that wouldn't stop, and Raymond held her while she broke down, held her while she tried to explain through tears what had happened, held her while she said they wouldn't help us, Daddy. They kept saying he was faking, they said he was dramatic, they threatened to restrain me if I didn't sit down, they let him die, Daddy, they just let him. Raymond's jaw tightened hearing Maya's explanation, tightened with fury that was cold and focused, tightened with determination that everyone who'd failed his children would face consequences, and he said, "You saved him, baby, you called, you didn't give up, you did everything right, I'm so proud of you, you saved your brother's life," and his words were meant to help her understand that she'd succeeded, that Xavier was alive because of her actions, that her 43 minutes of fighting had mattered. But Maya, hearing that she'd saved Xavier, hearing that her desperate phone call had worked, felt relief that was overwhelming, felt like she could finally breathe herself, felt like the weight that had been crushing her chest for 43 minutes was lifting, and she cried harder hearing her father's pride, cried with different quality of tears, cried with release rather than despair. Raymond stood after holding Maya, stood with his daughter still close to him, stood and faced the airline officials who'd been waiting nervously, and his voice when he spoke was quiet but carried authority that made grown men flinch, and he said, "I want every crew member from that flight detained, every single one who knew my son was in distress and did nothing. I want their employment terminated before that plane reaches Houston. I want full investigation into how this happened. I want medical records reviewed. I want witness statements taken. I want everything documented." And his instructions were delivered with precision of man accustomed to being obeyed, with tone that communicated this was not negotiable, with presence that made clear he would accept nothing less than complete accountability. A regional director nodded frantically hearing Raymond's orders, nodded with recognition that his own job might be at risk depending on investigation results, nodded with understanding that CO was personally involved, nodded saying, "Yes sir, immediately sir, we're already beginning documentation process. The crew members are being held, we have security monitoring them. Everything will be handled according to your specifications," and his deference, his immediate compliance, his visible fear, showed how power operated in corporate structures, showed what happened when negligence reached owner level, showed that Rebecca and Craig's careers had ended the moment Maya's call connected. Raymond turned and saw Rebecca and Craig stepping off plane, saw them looking confused by all the officials and security, saw them not yet understanding gravity of situation, and he walked toward them with Maya still beside him, walked with determined stride that made officials step aside, walked until he was standing directly in front of flight attendants who dismissed his dying son, and Rebecca, seeing all the officials and seeing ambulance and seeing man in expensive suit approaching, looked confused, looked like she didn't understand what was happening, looked at Raymond and said, "What's going on? Why was there emergency landing? Why are there so many officials here?" And her questions showed she still didn't connect diversion to teenager she'd called dramatic, still didn't realize that her negligence had been exposed. Raymond stepped forward with expression that was cold, with voice that was quiet but devastating, with presence that commanded absolute attention, and he said, "My name is Raymond Bishop, I own this airline, I own every plane in this fleet, I own every gate and every route. That boy you ignored for 43 minutes, That boy who almost died because you couldn't be bothered to provide emergency medical care, that boy who you called dramatic and anxious, is my son, and watching Rebecca's face. Drain of color hearing those words, watching recognition dawn, watching her understand that she'd dismissed Zoe's dying child, gave Raymond no satisfaction, gave him only fury that she'd needed to know Xavier's parentage to regret her actions, gave him rage that she wouldn't have cared if he'd been anyone else's son, gave him understanding that her remorse was about consequences to herself rather than harm to Xavier, and that recognition, that understanding that she regretted getting caught not hurting his child, made his next words even more devastating. Rebecca's face had drained of all color hearing Raymond identify himself, had gone pale with recognition of magnitude of her mistake, had shown panic that came from understanding her career was ending, and she stammered trying to form response, trying to explain, trying to minimize what she'd done, and she said, "Sir, we thought he was, there seemed to be, we see passengers exaggerate all the time, we didn't know," and her attempt to justify dismissing dying child, her suggestion that assuming black teenager was lying was reasonable, her claim that not knowing Xavier's parentage excused her negligence, showed she still didn't understand that the problem wasn't who Xavier's father was but that she'd let any child suffer, that she'd denied medical care based on racial profiling, that she'd threatened his sister with restraints for trying to save him. "You thought a black teenager in a hoodie was faking," Raymond said with voice that cut through Rebecca's stammering, with tone that named exactly what had happened, with words that made explicit what she wanted to leave implicit. "You thought his little sister was being dramatic, you thought their suffering didn't warrant your attention, you thought wrong, and his calling out of racial profiling, his naming of bias that had shaped her decisions, his refusal to let her hide behind claims of misunderstanding made Rebecca flinch, made her try to deny, made her say that's not what this was about, but Raymond's expression showed he had no patience for her denials, showed he understood exactly what had happened, showed he would accept no excuses. "You're terminated," Raymond said with finality that was absolute, with tone that communicated this was not negotiable, "both of you, effective immediately, your employment ends right now, your badges will be collected, your access revoked, and you'll be hearing from federal prosecutors about negligence charges, about failure to provide emergency medical care, about child endangerment, about criminal negligence that nearly killed my son, and his delivery of consequences, his immediate termination." His promise of criminal prosecution represented justice that was swift and complete, represented accountability that Rebecca and Craig had never faced before despite pattern of dismissing black passengers, represented moment when their racism finally cost them everything. Craig tried to speak hearing his termination, tried to say we didn't know he was really sick, we didn't realize it was that serious, we thought, but Raymond cut him off with gesture, with look, with voice that said you didn't care, that's worse than not knowing. You saw a child in distress and you assumed he was lying, you heard his sister begging and you threatened her. You had 43 minutes to reassess your initial judgment and you chose not to. That's not accident, that's choice. And his characterization of their sustained dismissal as choice rather than mistake, his framing of 43 minutes of negligence as deliberate rather than accidental, his naming of their moral failure, left Craig with no defense, with no justification, with nothing except recognition that he'd destroyed his own career. Security escorted Rebecca and Craig away within minutes, escorted them from the gate while other crew members watched, escorted them past passengers who'd witnessed their negligence, escorted them toward termination and criminal investigation, and neither looked back. Neither tried to apologize to Raymond or Maya, neither showed remorse for Xavier's suffering, and watching them leave, watching justice arrive swiftly, gave Maya first sense of closure, gave her recognition that her brother's near death had consequences, gave her understanding that sometimes the system did protect victims, though she was old enough to recognize that protection had come only because her father owned the airline, that other black children without powerful parents still got dismissed and threatened and left to die. At the hospital, Xavier was stabilized within hours, was treated by doctors who said frankly that another 10 minutes without oxygen could have caused permanent brain damage or death, was saved by emergency diversion his father had ordered, was alive because Maya had called for help, was breathing normally for first time in almost an hour, and Maya sat beside his hospital bed holding his hand while he slept, sat watching his chest rise and fall normally, sat crying with relief that was profound. And when Xavier finally opened his eyes hours later, the first thing he saw was his sister's tearful smile, and he whispered with voice that was hoarse, "You saved me." And Maya shook her head saying, "Daddy saved you, I just called." But Xavier squeezed her hand saying, "You didn't give up. That's what saved me. You kept fighting when I couldn't." If you're watching this and you realize you've been the bystander who stayed silent during someone's crisis, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being the person who intervenes next time. Because those passengers who watched Xavier nearly die will carry that guilt forever, will know their silence almost killed a child, so hit that subscribe button if you believe speaking up matters more than your comfort. Their father entered the hospital room with exhaustion and relief battling on his face, entered with recognition of how close he'd come to losing his son, entered with gratitude that Maya's call had reached him in time, and he sat on edge of Xavier's bed and pulled both children close saying, "I almost lost you. I almost lost my son because people looked at you and decided you weren't worth saving." But Xavier, looking at his father, said, "But you came, you always come," and Raymond kissed his son's forehead saying, "Always, no matter what, no matter where, I will always come, I will always protect you, I will always fight for you." 3 weeks later, after Xavier had recovered enough to travel, after investigations had been completed, after criminal charges had been filed, Rebecca Martinez and Craig Henderson faced trial for criminal negligence, faced prosecution that revealed pattern of dismissed complaints from black passengers, faced evidence that they'd ignored medical emergencies before, faced witnesses who testified about their behavior, and jury hearing evidence, hearing Maya's testimony about 43 minutes of begging for help, hearing doctors testify that Xavier would have died without intervention, found them guilty on all counts, and judge sentenced each to 18 months in federal prison and banned them from ever working in aviation again, and 4 other crew members who'd witnessed Xavier's distress and done nothing were terminated, and 3 faced civil suits that would cost them everything. The airline implemented mandatory medical response training under Raymond's direct oversight, implemented protocols specifically addressing unconscious bias in emergency situations, implemented procedures ensuring no passenger's medical emergency could be dismissed without verification, and Raymond named the new training program the Xavier Initiative, named it after his son who'd nearly died, named it so every employee would understand that dismissing patients had consequences, named it as reminder that medical emergencies required immediate response regardless of patient's appearance, and the initiative became model that other airlines adopted, became standard that changed industry, became Xavier's legacy born from his suffering. At their grandfather's retirement ceremony that was rescheduled so Xavier could attend, at celebration that nearly hadn't happened, at party where family gathered on old family home's porch, their grandfather who'd spent 40 years running into burning buildings pulled Xavier and Maya close and said, "I heard what happened. You both showed more courage on that plane than most people show in lifetime. Xavier, you fought to stay alive. Maya, you fought to save your brother. That's what heroes look like." And hearing this from man who'd saved countless lives, hearing him call them heroes, made the siblings cry, made them hold each other, made them recognize they'd survived something terrible together, and their grandfather wiped his eyes saying, "You're stronger than you know." But the resolution wasn't perfect because Xavier had PTSD from the near-death experience, had panic attacks when thinking about flying, had nightmares about suffocating, had anxiety that required therapy, had trauma that medication and cognitive behavioral therapy could manage but not erase, and Maya had her own trauma from watching her brother nearly die, had recurring dreams about his blue lips, had hypervigilance about medical emergencies, had difficulty trusting authority figures, had scars that would take years to heal, and justice for Rebecca and Craig didn't undo the 43 minutes of terror, didn't restore the innocence they'd lost, didn't eliminate the therapy bills or the medications or the fear, and Rebecca in federal prison learned nothing, spent 18 months bitter rather than remorseful, was released unemployable and angry, died years later having never accepted responsibility. And the Xavier Initiative helped future passengers but couldn't help Xavier and Maya. Couldn't give them back what racism had stolen, couldn't make them whole again, could only ensure their suffering had prevented others from experiencing the same, and that imperfect justice, that partial healing, that incomplete accountability, was what real-world resolution looked like, was recognition that sometimes you survive and get consequences for perpetrators but still carry wounds forever.